Well, it's another Tuesday in another week of another year here on planet Earth, which means Dr. Brad Tucker is standing by to bring us all the latest science and space news, proving that we're not just about Star Trek.
With Dr. Brad Tucker and Matt Miller, this is Talkin' Science on Trekzone.
Well, it's another Tuesday, and he's with me now, and we can see each other while we're recording, which is absolutely fantastic. The marvels of technology, Brad. Welcome to another Talkin' Science.
Yeah, that newfangled camera technology. That's right. Now I can spy on you, really.
It's probably a good thing that the viewers can't see where we are, our messy offices and our messy hairstyles and all that sort of stuff.
If I had time to clean my office, then I wouldn't be busy. So,
Well, we prefer you to be busy finding ththings and discovering things and making new things rather than tidying an office.
Yeah, ignoring travel receipts, that sorts of things too that you have to deal with. I'm looking at. I got an old photographic plate. I got a drawing from my son of a rocket. I got travel receipts, and I have a subpoena all right next to me.
Okay.
For the record, so I am an expert witness for Australia for astronomical phenomena.
Right, okay.
So when there's a case that involves, hey, sun was in my eyes or something like that, or anything related to moon or sunlighting, I'm the go-to person.
You're the go-to person for moonlighting, did you say?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Not gaslighting, moonlighting.
I love it. All right, well, let's get serious for our first story, which is a bit of a tragic one. Major General Alexei Leonov has passed away, the first human to walk in space 54 years ago.
People forget that in the early days of the space race, the USSR, Russia, was just beating the Americans across everything. So it wasn't just Yuri Gagarin with the first flight, but Alexei with the very first EVA. And I would actually say the very first EVA, the very first spacewalk, was way more dangerous than Yuri's. Not diminishing anything that he did, but animals were tested in flight, right? The Russia's famous for sending up dogs, and we sent up monkeys and all sorts of things. The first animal around the moon, do you know the first animal around the moon?
Was a dog.
It was a tortoise.
It was a tortoise. Oh, well, there you go.
Yeah. But no one had actually tested a spacewalk because there was just no way to test what happens when you go in the vacuum of space. And there was a lot of, maybe he gets crushed, maybe he implodes. No one knows what happens in the vacuum of space of a human body. It was a huge unknown, and he was the person to take that risk. And it's so really a pioneer and a very crucial thing. And it just so happened that when his death was announced, NASA was doing a spacewalk that they actually kind of halted to commemorate while doing their own spacewalk, the very first person who did a spacewalk.
Oh, wow. Well, and as you say, it's so fraught with danger, and it's stuff that you can't test on Earth. Is the cabin going to repressurize? Is it going to depressurize? Is he going to be sucked out? All those sort of things. So such a pioneer, and I think that Russia in some ways isn't given the due that it deserves for, if nothing else, pushing the Americans to push the final frontier.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it was a good example. So when he did a spacewalk, the spacewalk was only 12 minutes. It was short, but his spacesuit actually puffed out, essentially started to get bigger and almost not quite depressurized, but because of the pressure and the way it was pressurized, he puffed out. He could not fit back in the capsule. He could not get back in. Oh. So what had to happen was he had to actually release a valve and actually kind of poke a hole. If you've seen The Martian, where he punctures his hand and he turns into Iron Man, as he calls it, where he floats around. Well, Alexei kind of had to do that, where he had to release a whole bunch of pressure from his suit into the vacuum of space so he could fit back in, knowing fair well the consequences of if he depressurizes too much, he will change the pressure in his body, and then his blood will start to boil. The nitrogen will start to boil, and he could boil alive in space. I mean, knowing full well that if he gets it wrong by a few seconds, that's the outcome. That's what he had to go through to get back in. Really dangerous stuff. And it is those little lessons that really helped the Americans when they attempted it 10 weeks later. And as you said, help push and help the U.S. space program.
And funnily enough, it seems that mission, the spacewalk, wasn't the hardest part. They crash landed deep in the Russian woods and almost didn't return to Earth.
Yeah, I mean, nothing kind of went well for his first mission into space. And yet he wanted to go back. And because of how essentially good of a job he did, they wanted to find another suiting mission. And eventually what happened was, after a couple of delays and missing missions, and they canceled their moon mission, he was the commander of the Soyuz Apollo mission, which was the first time that Apollo and Soyuz joined in space, which led to cooperation between the Mir and the space shuttle and eventually the International Space Station. So again, he turned it into being the first person to really set cooperation between the US and Russia. Keeping in mind, this is in 75, I think, or 72 rather. We're talking about height of the Cold War, leading the pioneer for the US and Russia to cooperate in space.
Well, he turned 85 in May, so he had a good innings. And of course, we do thank him and commemorate his service to advancing humankind's understanding of space.
Indeed.
Get exclusive access to podcast and behind-the-scenes info by becoming a member on Patreon today. Supporting Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek gets even better with membership starting at just $1 per month. Jump over to patreon.com/TrekZone.org.au.
Alrighty, Brad, well, let's move out into the solar system. Saturn has taken over Jupiter by 3 on its count of moons.
It is. It is a competition. It's kind of like the two brothers fighting to be the best. Jupiter and Saturn do the same thing. And it was funny. We were talking about, the story came out just as we released last week's episode by hours, that 20 new moons of Saturn have been discovered to take it to its total of 82. So reclaiming the title back essentially from Jupiter, who's held it for, I think, about 20-ish years, to get to that total of 82, beating Jupiter's total of 79.
20 previously unknown moons were discovered. Some only 5 kilometers across. How does this come about? What happened? What aligned for all these discoveries?
Yeah, so it's interesting. So it's similar to how the 12 new moons of Jupiter were discovered about 18 months ago from a similar group. What people have been trying to do, just as what we're doing here, what on the projects I'm leading, is find if there's a potential 9th planet around it, a very far planet. So we're looking for very slow, faint moving things. Faint because if it's a really far away planet, it's going to be faint. But it just so happens that parameters, looking for faint, slow moving things, is also for very small objects moving around Jupiter and Saturn. So these moons of Saturn are not near the other moons. So when we think about Titan and its rings, Saturn's rings, this is really far away from the planet. So they go really far out and they're really tiny. So they've been really hard to see. You're literally trying to see something a few kilometers wide, something less than the size of most cities by far, and yet you're trying to see it over 1 billion kilometers away in the midst of everything else. And so it's been a really big trick, but doing a very complete survey, it appears that they think they found all of the moons down to about 5 kilometers. There might be smaller ones, but this requires essentially a bigger telescope, the next generation telescope, to see. So we think we know all of the moons now of Jupiter and Saturn down to about 5 kilometers.
And this helps us understand Saturn's past and I guess the formation of the solar system as well, to see where it's traveled through and what it's picked up along its journey.
Yeah, because there's a very interesting clue relating that these moons are slightly different. So there's two sets of moons. So there's ones that move in the same direction of the planet spinning, and there are others that spin the other way. So there's a retrograde and a prograde group. Now, normally everything in space forms the same way that it's spinning, and that actually goes back to the very beginning of how a solar system's formed. The spinning ball of gas and angular momentum, conservation of momentum. So the same reason you can spin around in your desk chair keeps it spinning around in the same direction. Exactly. We're doing a live demo here now.
If only the people could see.
That's right. Physics and reality. So that's just how everything naturally forms. For something to spin the opposite direction means that it probably didn't form in the same spot. It either was captured, something either collided with it, or something else, that it formed by definition almost differently than everything else that's just spinning around normally. Venus does this. Venus spins the other way in terms of its axis compared to all the other planets. And Venus, because of this, Venus has a very slow day. We think Mondays are long on Earth. tri-Venus. And so it means that something happened also to Venus. So these are big clues about how these moons formed. And since they're so far out, we know, again, they're different from, say, the moons forming around the rings of Saturn. So quite an interesting discovery here.
Are we going to find any more moons around Jupiter, and is it going to take its title back?
We think Jupiter is also complete, so it's the same group, and they didn't find any new ones. They found about 12 of them, as I said, about 18 months ago. So we don't think there's going to be any new ones that are found anytime soon, again, until the next generation of telescopes are built in the next 5 years. So it appears Saturn's going to hold the title for at least a decade. Take that, Jupiter. And again, there might be tinier ones. No one's discounting this, but in terms of the ones we could detect, this is currently the total.
New content is being added all the time to Trekzone's YouTube channel, Talking Science, with Dr. Brad Tucker on Tuesdays, Trekzone Live on Thursdays, and a Trekzone Conversation on Saturdays. Don't miss a moment. Subscribe and ring the bell to get fresh public releases.
Alrighty, Brad. Well, our last story involves Boeing and its attempt to launch the unpiloted Starliner to the space station in December.
Yeah, so we've heard a lot about SpaceX and the Dragon 2 capsule trying to take humans to space. And Dragon 2 had their Uncrewed Test flight where they put the dummy into the space station in April, as we talked about, and then it had that catastrophic failure on the abort test afterwards. But Boeing's in this race as well, and they have what's called the CST Starliner, which is kind of cool because if you think of the Dreamliner, the new 787, well, they have the Starliner, which is kind of like the same naming scheme. But I don't know how many peanuts you get on this one, but I think there's more legroom on this one, by the way. So they're aiming to do the uncrewed test, where essentially what SpaceX did in April, they send it to the space station with some stuff in it, potentially a dummy. It docks, it does the full testing, comes back down and returns. So they do the full testing without a human in it. If it all goes according to plan and they do their abort tests both in November and afterwards, and it all works, Boeing is going to be sending people up mid-next year to the space station.
And it's not really a race in the traditional sense, is it? They're all sort of coming together to form the various parts of the next generation of space vehicles.
Yeah, Boeing and SpaceX have had different views. They've both won the contracts. It's not like NASA's going to choose one or the other. They're both going to be used, and they both will have slightly different purposes. Whereas, SpaceX wants to spin out their technology to go into Mars eventually. Boeing's doing it to work with the space launch systems. And so it's a nice cooperation, but it's interesting because these private companies are slightly competing, but also slightly working together to return humans launching from the U.S. to space, because that is the goal, which is interesting because it looks like we are on track for next year, Americans launching from the U.S. to the International Space Station, which will change quite dramatically the way space happens. Because as soon as that happens, you can sure NASA will stop their contract with the Russians of taking Americans to the space station, which means what is Russia going to do? It could do two ways. They could have less launches, or that means they will be looking for more partners to buy seats. Because right now, there's usually an American, a Russian, and a third. Sometimes it's a second American or Russian, usually someone from another country. As we talked about a couple weeks ago, someone from the UAE. This might open more seats at a cheaper rate, which means other countries, maybe even Australia, will have a better chance of bidding, of putting an astronaut on that seat, because the Americans are going to be sending it on U.S. craft.
I don't think it's available just yet or within the reach of private investors, though.
No, it's not. It is not for the private angle yet, but it's going to change by having 3 different vehicles that can take people to the International Space Station instead of one, the Soyuz. That means more things can go up, more people, more experiments, faster rotations, longer rotations. And then that, again, will fuel some of these other developments. So, every year, space is just taking another jump and jump and jump, and we'll see another one of this next year. How Boeing goes at the end of this year will signal how fast it's going to happen. But it does look like both Boeing and SpaceX will be launching humans next year from the U.S.
Watch this space.
Watch this space. That's right. And I love you.
Love it, Brad. Thanks as always for talking science. We'll catch you next week.
Thanks.
You can get social with Trekzone. Australia's unofficial home of Star Trek is everywhere you are. Get the wrap-up on our Facebook page. Keep in the loop on Twitter and relive Trek episodes on Instagram. Just search for Trekzone.